Hi, America. Hello, world, and welcome to episode 4 of the Looming Fiscal Crisis series being brought to you by the Compact for America Educational Foundation and the Commissioners of the Compact for a Balanced Budget. In this episode, we will highlight the Compact's state-of-the-art balanced budget amendment, explaining how the amendment was created, who was involved in the policy process, key goals and objectives of the amendment, and a walkthrough of the amendment text itself. My name is Chip DeMoss, and I will be the host of this episode. I am the executive director of the foundation, which has been designated as the official administrator of the Compact for a Balanced Budget. The Compact currently has 5 member states, including Alabama, Alaska, Georgia, Mississippi, and North Dakota, and the legislatures of each of the member states have designated the Compact Commission as the official governmental body to represent the member states before Congress when it comes to federal budgetary matters. With me today, we are honored to have one of the founding sponsors of the Compact, Mr. Curtis Olafson from the state of North Dakota. We will meet Curtis in a moment, but before we start today, I would ask that if you like what you hear and want more of this content, please click on the like and subscribe buttons below and share this channel with your friends and colleagues. If you click on the notification bell, you will be alerted when we post new episodes. You will also find a link below where you can donate to this effort. We are a 501c3 nonprofit entity, so all donations are tax deductible. And if you or anyone you know would like to sponsor any of our future episodes, please contact me. In today's episode, we will first get to know Curtis a little better. After that, we will provide a timeline on the previous BBA efforts by both Congress and the states, what the key goals and objectives are, how the different provisions of the BBA came about, and the major principal compromises that were necessary to gain support on both sides of the aisle. So to get us going and to provide an opportunity for our viewers to get to know you, Curtis, it would be fun to take a few moments to find out about your background and what led you to your involvement with the Compact. Hey, Curtis.
Yeah, hi, Chip. Good to be with you.
Hey, we'd like to know, get to know you a little bit better, find out why folks like you like to become involved in the Compact. So tell us some fun things like, where did you grow up? When did your ancestors first come over to America? Well, what did your mother and father do? Do you have any siblings? Where did you go to school? What is your current day job? And what are some of the highlights of your professional career? We'd love to find out more about you.
Well, I have spent my entire life on the farm and ranch, originally homesteaded by my pioneer Icelandic grandparents on my father's side. I'm of pure Icelandic descent. All of my ancestors came from Iceland starting in the early 1880s. On the wall behind me is a picture of those paternal grandparents. This is grandparents now, not great-grandparents. They came to a treeless, rock-strewn quarter section of land in North Dakota in 1883. They had 65 cents left in their pockets with which to start a new way of life. So my family has been keenly focused on fiscal responsibility since the very beginning of the time my family came to this country. On my mother's side, my maternal grandparents came here. It was actually my great-grandparents came here, after which my grandmother, maternal grandmother, was born here. She was the only one of my 4 grandparents that were born here in North Dakota, but her parents had just come from Iceland. And my maternal grandfather came to this country in 1905 at the age of 18. And they were pioneer settlers who struggled, and the federal program available to them was very simple. Roll up your sleeves and go to work. So they did. The grandparents behind me here, 15 years later, they built a brand new house, which was a mansion compared to the small 12 by 16 foot sod and log hut that they were living in. My parents were operating the farm and ranch here for all of their lives, and I entered the family business at the age of 16 with three older brothers, and we had interests in farming and ranching and earth moving construction. And my specialty in our four brother partnership was the cattle operation, which I later ramped up to be a purebred registered cattle breeding operation. That was the segment that I managed. I had also had a sister who lived in the area, and now today there are only two of us siblings left. My older brother and I have exited the family farming partnership, and I'm selling out my interest to my nephew. I have two children. My daughter is an assistant state's attorney in Fargo, North Dakota. My son is executive vice president and chief financial officer of a bank with 8 branches. So I tell people that I'm really fortunate to have two children, both of whom are more mature and more responsible than I am, and they both make more money. So that's a good place to be as a dad. And I went to school locally, graduated from a high school class of about 24 kids, and then went on to North Dakota State University, where I majored in animal science. I also was active in the flying club in college and got my private pilot's license. And as a publicity stunt, after they elected me president, I came up with the idea of parking our airplane right alongside the front steps of the student union to attract the attention of prospective members. And I think my fellow club members thought I was out of my mind, and so did the Fargo Police Department desk sergeant when I called him to tell him we wanted to tow an airplane into the campus. But the crazy stunt was successful, because before we did that, we had 18 members and we owned 1 airplane, and within a year we had 90 members and we owned 3 airplanes. So sometimes you have to get their attention. So that was a lesson I learned very early on in college, and that's still true today. So that's why we're here before you, America and the world, to bring to your attention the Compact for America Balanced Budget Amendment, which is the best product out there. After I'd been farming and ranching for quite a number of years, then I had an opportunity to get into the North Dakota State Senate, which I did in 2006. My predecessor in the Senate resigned to accept the position of Chief Deputy Attorney General. And under North Dakota law, when there is a vacancy in the legislature, then the District Executive Committee has the authority to appoint the successor to that legislative seat. So I was fortunate to be appointed to that seat in 2006, and later went through the full election cycle in 2008 and was elected for a 4-year term at that time. During the course of my time in the legislature, I served as vice chairman of the Judiciary Committee and vice chairman of the Political Subdivisions Committee. I found the Judiciary Committee to be really fascinating, and I'm actually giving some consideration to getting back into the Senate and have a plan in mind on how to do that. So I miss serving in the Senate. It really was a wonderful opportunity, and it opened up other doors for me. And it was while I was in the Senate that I got an email one day from the founders of the National Debt Relief Amendment. And the email was sent out to over 7,000 legislators. And I know we're going to talk about the National Debt Relief Amendment itself in a minute. But when I looked at this email in October of 2010, and I saw its simplicity and its power, I inherently understood that right from the first time I looked at it. And the video that the founder sent out invited legislators who were receiving it to give them a call. So I did. I was the first one to call in, and later I ended up as the national spokesman for the National Debt Relief Amendment and traveled all over the country, talking to my legislative colleagues in dozens of states and testifying in legislative committee hearings. never pass up a good opportunity because it opens up doors for others. That's been my journey in life and my lesson to others who may be considering opportunities and maybe thinking they should just pass it by. So don't ever
Well,
pass it.
I do have one question before we get into the details of the BBA. I do have one question on your family background. What was it that caused them to look at North Dakota all the way from, you say Iceland, is that
From
right?
Iceland. Yeah.
What was it that drew them to North Dakota?
Well, it was in no small part the Homesteading Act, which had been passed by Congress. The provisions of that were that if you would establish a home on a quarter section of land and plant a certain acreage of trees and remain on that land, I believe it was for 10 years, then you were given full warranty deed to that quarter section of land. And when my grandparents came here, there were no trees. They actually walked over some of the best farmland in the world in the Red River Valley because it was an absolutely treeless prairie that was very poorly drained. And they had grown up being used to land that was being flooded when glaciers would melt suddenly, and especially if they were under a volcano that happened to become active. And so they instinctively looked for higher ground. So they kept walking until they came to the first hill out of the Red River Valley, which is only about 75 feet high. But that was, and then there was in this area, it was along an escarpment and through which ran some deep coulees, and there were wooded areas there. So the people who settled here in this area were mostly of Icelandic descent in this part of my county. And so there were several hundred people came here from Iceland starting in about 1878. And my family started coming in 1883. And again, as I said, they had the clothes on their backs, the small wooden trunk, they had the family Bibles, and they had 65 cents left in their pockets. That's what they started with. My grandfather walked 20 miles to a neighboring town and would work all week in a lumber yard so that he could scrape together enough money to buy a horse and a cow. And those were important things for survival. And he would often walk that 20 miles carrying a sack of salt or sugar or flour. Salt, sugar, and flour were the three essentials. He would walk 20 miles. I assume it was a 50-pound bag. And he was about my size, about 6 feet, 180. I used to be 180. And so they were tough people. They had to be, and they were faced with the situation. Iceland was experiencing some very, very difficult times because of polar pack ice was assaulting the northern part of the country where most of the immigrants came from, and so they couldn't get the fishing boats out of the harbor. They couldn't get the sheep out on the pastures, and people were literally starving to death. And it was a very dire situation. So there were several thousand people left Iceland and came to either North Dakota, and there's another large group of settlers that settled about 2 hours north of here, north of the Winnipeg area.
So many great stories like that on the founding of our country, aren't there? It's so fun to go back into family history and find all about that. Well, we're glad they came. We're glad you're here. Let's talk a little bit about efforts to balance the budget in the United States. Congress really was one of the first groups to really try to do something to require that the budget be balanced. It's amazingly that in the Constitution there is no requirement for a balanced budget amendment. So really, the first time that Congress really started looking hard at a balanced budget amendment was under President Reagan in the early 80s. And they actually came fairly close to proposing a constitutional amendment. As most people may know, it takes 2/3 of each house of Congress to propose an amendment to the U.S. Constitution. And with Strom Thurmond, with him presenting S.J. Res 58, it actually did pass the Senate by the required 2/3 majority, but it fell short in the House, substantially short, 46 votes, I believe, to the 2/3. Just to give folks an idea of what Strom Thurmond was thinking about at that point in time. Basically, and I won't read this word for word, but each year Congress must adopt a statement of receipts and outlays that theoretically would balance. And it's up to the Congress and the president then to pursue legislation that would assure that those outlays do not exceed the revenues for that specific year. And then they got into some stuff that's kind of a little bit difficult to understand how constitutionally this could ever happen. Let me just read you this as an example. Total receipts for any fiscal year set forth in this statement shall not increase by a rate greater than the rate of increase in national income in the year or years ending not less than 6 months nor more than 12 months before the fiscal year. Curtis, do you have any idea what that means?
I think it's a formula for failure myself.
Unless a majority of the whole number of houses of Congress shall pass a bill directing that.
Yeah.
Again, it's Congress. Every time it presents a proposal, it itself is the one that can waive such proposal. And then
Of
you get into
course.
Section 3. Congress may waive the provisions of this article for any fiscal year in which there's a declaration of war. I believe currently we still have over 20 declarations of war that are still in effect, Curtis. So
Yeah, well, the thing that people need to understand about Congress is they will never impose fiscal restraints on themselves. It has to come from the outside, and we're going to talk about that when we get to the National Debt Relief Amendment.
all right. Well, that was Strom Thurmond's effort under President Reagan. Now we'll come back to that because the balanced budget amendment failed in Congress. President Reagan then at that time urged the states maybe to see if they could propose an amendment on their own. We'll come back to that in a minute. And one thing important to note about the Strom Thurmond amendment, it was the only constitutional amendment for a balanced budget amendment that's ever passed the Senate. It's the only one. Then it wasn't for another 15 years then under President Reagan that there was a big push in the House and the Senate to get a balanced budget amendment passed. The H.J. Res 1 by Representative Barton from Texas made the proposal, and it actually passed the House by a substantial margin, 300 to 132. And then you get into the two famous votes in the Senate. In 1995, the first vote fell short. One vote, 66 to 34. They needed 67 votes in the Senate to pass. They fell one vote short. But I do believe, Curtis, that vote was preordained. I don't believe it was ever really that close.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And again, it goes against human nature, especially with the mindset of those who serve in political office, to impose restraints on themselves. They just, that's not human nature. And especially someone who rises to the level of serving in the U.S. House or the U.S. Senate, they're not going to tie their own hands willingly. It's going to have to come from the outside.
Interestingly, they were able to bring that bill up again in the same Senate in the next year, 1996, for another vote. And again, it fell short this time by 2 votes, 64 to 35. This is the proposal. Again, fiscal outlays shall not exceed total receipts unless there's 3/5 of the vote of Congress to waive it. Again, they're going to have Congress waive anything. They did attempt to address the debt limit in a balanced budget amendment for the first time, which I thought was good. That required that they said that the debt limit cannot be increased unless 3/5 of the House and the Senate shall provide a law for that increase. So this is one of the first times they're actually trying to tie in the debt limit to the balanced budget amendment. Again, and another thing they're trying to address in the balanced budget amendment is tax increases. This section 4 in this bill said no bill to increase revenue, which will be a tax increase, shall become law unless approved by a majority of the whole members of the House. And then again, Congress can waive any of these provisions when there's a war. And then Congress shall be the one to enforce the article. And interestingly enough, they in their definitions, they exclude receipts from borrowing in the calculation of total receipts. So it's always been an enigma to us how you can incorporate a debt limit into a balanced budget amendment when you don't allow receipts from debt or payments from debt to either be part of the calculation itself. So that was that one. Then there was another effort again under President Clinton, and Orrin Hatch was behind this. This was in 1997, and this is the last time that Congress has attempted to pass a balanced budget amendment. So that's well over 20 years ago. Again, this fell short by one vote, but contains many of the same provisions that we saw in the previous one. This is the Orrin Hatch one of 1997. Total outlays for any fiscal year shall not exceed total receipts. Again, down below, you'll see where they exclude debt from this definition. So again, it's hard to understand how this would work. Again, they tried to address debt. The limit on the debt held by the public shall not be increased, and they raised it to 3/5 of the whole number of the House shall provide it. No bill to increase revenue shall become law unless approved by a majority of the House. That's a tax increase.
Yep.
And again, Congress can waive any of these provisions from when there's wars or any other thing. So in my mind, after reading through the history and the show of all that, I really do think it's more of a show vote than anything else. What are your thoughts on that, Curtis?
Sure, it was. It was to appease people who wanted some fiscal responsibility in this country, and most people do. And Congress, throughout its modern history, has been hearing from a lot of constituents who are deeply troubled by the fiscal irresponsibility. But you'll notice that in every one of those bill drafts, Congress gave themselves several exit doors, several trap doors to get out of what the bill actually would impose upon them. They had all kinds of ways to know. They didn't have to comply with the provisions of the bill by a simple vote. That's what's different about the compact BBA.
Well, again, you see the last time Congress tried to get a balanced budget amendment passed, and whether it was a serious effort or not, we don't really know, but it was 1998.
Right.
Let's go back to the 1980s under President Reagan, when he got frustrated with Congress being unable to pass anything, and he started encouraging the states to get involved because, as we all know, under the Constitution, under Article 5, which is the article that all constitutional amendments are proposed and ratified, it gave not only Congress the right to propose amendments, it gave the states the rights to propose amendments. And so President Reagan turned to the states. He turned to some of his friends at the National Taxpayers Union and said, guys, see what you can do. I've been unable to get Congress to do anything. See if y'all can get the states to respond. And so there was a big effort. It really, I think this really started a little bit earlier in the late 70s. And by 1982, 31 states had passed various forms of resolution petitioning for some type of Article 5 convention to propose a balanced budget amendment. I mean, that's pretty significant. That's a lot amount of work done in a short amount of time. Unfortunately, though, it wasn't coordinated. Each state was kind of on its own. They each submitted their own resolution. The resolutions really didn't match each other. Some were very detailed resolutions. Some were not detailed at all. So I can give some examples. Let me show you a couple of examples of those. Here's a resolution that was passed in 1977. It happened to be from the great state of Texas. This was the talk of the town, late 70s, other 80s, that they needed to do something done about balancing the budget. So when you get through all the preamble and the wording on all that, when you get right down to it, here's what the state of Texas asked for. That first they asked that Congress try to get a balanced budget amendment on their own, but alternatively, if Congress couldn't do it, that the state requested that a convention for the specific purpose of proposing an amendment to the Constitution requiring that in the absence of a national emergency, that the total of all federal appropriations made by the Congress for any fiscal year may not exceed the total of all estimated revenues for that fiscal year. Yeah, it says what they want, but it doesn't get into very much detail on
No.
on how to make a constitutional amendment out of that.
No, and I'd like to point something out in there in that language too, and we've seen this before in many different places. If you read through your Constitution, the phrase constitutional convention cannot be found within the Constitution. It's an Article 5 amendments convention. The difference is more than just semantics. The founding fathers never intended for a full-blown plenary constitutional convention that would totally rewrite the Constitution. That's why you can't find the phrase constitutional convention in the Constitution. It's termed, they deliberately labeled it an amendments convention because they could foresee the need to, from time to time, amend the Constitution, but not totally rewrite it. A constitutional convention suggests, by its very wording, that this would be a convention to start all over and rewrite the Constitution, and that was in no way what the founding fathers intended.
Again, good effort, but it wasn't coordinated.
Right.
And that was the problem. Aggregation meaning that all the requests coming from the different states have a common request.
Right.
And there was strong support that Congress would say, no, these don't amount to 34 common requests for the same thing. They're all over the board. So I think that kind of fizzled out for the time for about 20, almost 30 years until really about 2010. And then Curtis, that's when you said you got involved in the National Debt Relief Amendment effort. Tell us what that was all about.
Well, that was founded by two gentlemen from Texas, Glenn Hughes and James Booth, who were watching the direction our country was going. They were deeply troubled by it, as were and still are many Americans. And so they took it upon themselves to work to try to come up with an idea that would resonate with the American people. So they deployed a good friend of ours, Chip, Nick Duranius, and between the three of them, they came up with the National Debt Relief Amendment. It's very simple, it's elegant in its simplicity. Here's the idea. It's 18 words. An increase in the federal debt requires approval of a majority of the legislatures of the separate states. That became a national effort. I was in the state Senate at the time. We got it passed in North Dakota. We got it passed in Louisiana. And they asked me to be the national spokesman for the effort, which I was honored to do. And so I traveled to a lot of different states. We came very close to passing it in other states and would have passed it in many, many more states if not for opposition from two groups, that being the John Birch Society and the Eagle Forum, who frequently showed up in legislative hearings to plant the seeds of discontent with the phrase runaway convention. I have never myself had any concern whatsoever about a runaway convention that was convened under Article 5 of the Constitution as an amendments convention. There are a list of at least 8 to 10 safeguards to prevent that from happening. But the fear was irrational, but the fear was real, and perception is reality, is the way the old saying goes. So we had a number of states in which we came very close to adding more states to that list, supporting the National Debt Relief Amendment, and and I have to clarify that the language that you now have up on the screen, that's not actual amendment language. This would be a concept under which an amendments convention and its commissioners, they're technically commissioners, not delegates, but the commissioners would convene to consider this concept and come up with proper amendment language. But this is the linchpin of it, that it forces external discipline on Congress. We talked a little while ago about how they'll always make sure they have a way to circumvent the intent of the legislation. And any balanced budget amendment that might be passed in this country is going to need something very much like the National Debt Relief Amendment if it's to be successful and do what we want it to do. Otherwise, Congress, they're very clever at this. They will find a way to circumvent the intent of the amendment. So that brings me forward to when the National Debt Relief Amendment was incorporated into the Compact for America Balanced Budget Amendment by, again, a brilliant man, the author Nick Durranius, who worked on both efforts, both the National Debt Relief Amendment and the Compact for America Balanced Budget Amendment draft. And so he of all people understood the power of the National Debt Relief Amendment and the necessity for it in the Compact for America Balanced Budget Amendment. Without something like this, if you're going to pass a balanced budget amendment and you don't have this external discipline forcing Congress to actually do what the amendment says, the amendment wouldn't be worth the paper it was written on. But the Compact for America does include, in strong language, the National Debt Relief Amendment concept. And that I think that's an absolute necessity for any BBA to ever be successful.
Well, just about the time that you were experiencing all that pushback from those other organizations, 2013, 2014, really three different separate efforts sprung up about that time to push forward from the state perspective on a balanced budget amendment. The Balanced Budget Amendment Task Force really attempted to revive the National Taxpayers Union's effort. They were going to see if they could get to 34 states and then make an argument before Congress that they had, in fact, achieved the requirement. In fact, they're still trying to get to the 34 states. They've lost a few states in the process. So they say they have anywhere from 28 to 32 resolutions that they believe that they can aggregate at this time. There was another group called Center for State-Led National Debt Solutions that pretty much took the same effort, although they felt like a little bit fewer could be aggregated. So they're more along the lines of 28 as opposed to 32. So that effort is still alive, but they have a big task ahead of them if they're going to ever get Congress to play along with that concept. You also had the Convention of States come about in 2013, and they are proposing a convention to draft not only a balanced budget amendment, but several other proposals. Interestingly, they are proposing what's called a drafting convention, where you send delegates to the convention and the delegates come up with the proposals and spend the time to craft them. You know, on something as complicated as a balanced budget amendment, there could be some constraints to timing on that, because we know how long it took to craft ours, over 2 years. I'm just not sure if a convention is the right process to do something as a technical as a BBA could. Let me show you those real quick.
Yeah, and while you're pulling that up, Chip, I have to say that I support any of the efforts to try to impose fiscal responsibility and restraint on our federal government. So I've been supportive of the Balanced Budget Amendment Task Force, the Center for State-Led National Debt Solutions, for the Convention of States group. I think it's good that all of these ideas are out there. They are not mutually exclusive at all, and we are all pursuing the same thing with a little different approach, and that's a good thing. Let the American people decide which is the best approach. And if a convention is ever convened under either of the other two efforts, I would hope that they would recognize the value of the Compact for America Balanced Budget Amendment, because it is by far the best draft of a balanced budget amendment that I have ever seen. I've seen a few people take a stab at it, but this one is clearly the best product out there.
Great points, Curtis. Great points. Thanks for that. And this is the Convention of States resolution, and they are applying for a convention that would do three things: impose fiscal restraints on the federal government, limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government, and limit the terms of office for federal officials.
Right.
So they don't get into any details on what the balanced budget amendment might be. They totally leave it up to the convention to figure that out.
Yeah, and we can debate all day whether that's the best approach or not. Some people think it is. All of them have their strong points and the pros and cons, but I think here's the major difference between those efforts and the Compact for America. Compact for America Balanced Budget Amendment is the only approach that completely eliminates any concern about a runaway convention, and that's key. That's been the poison pill that has always been put in front of every other effort out there. No one can make an argument that there'll be a runaway convention with the Compact for America BBA approach, because the entire set of rules and procedures and the amendment language itself have been agreed to in advance by the member states. This was drafted by renowned constitutional legal scholars. It's an idea that has been fully developed. No one will walk into a convention hall wondering what's going to happen when they come out of the convention hall in 24 hours, because the convention is limited to 24 hours. You mentioned time constraints. This one will be over very quickly because everything has been locked down in advance.
And that's going to be the topic for our next podcast, exactly, is to go into the details. Love to have you join us on that one and talk about all the details of how the compact was actually crafted to address all the concerns. We didn't ignore the concerns. We took them seriously, and we said, okay, if that's your concern, we'll figure out a way to deal with that. So
and it was done masterfully to address every single concern that we had ever heard through the advancement of other efforts. We heard all the reasons why this was going to be a runaway convention. I think we did we in the Compact for America group, I think we did the right thing by completely addressing every single one of those concerns and putting them to rest.
That gets us to the point of drafting and crafting the actual Compact for a Balanced Budget Amendment. And I wanted to start off on that. So I think it was really important after we saw everything that was presented to what the states had tried to do previously, what Congress had tried to do previously. But I think one of the first things that we wanted to attempt to do was to incorporate debt into the balance equations, that revenues and expenses and debt receipts and debt repayments all make up the equation for a balanced budget amendment. And that we've got 7 sections in the Compact's BBA. And really the first section just lays the framework that basically says that outlays cannot exceed total receipts unless the excess is financed exclusively by debt that's issued in strict conformity with this article. And Curtis, that's the next 2 sections. We'll come to you, but that's where we incorporated the National Debt Relief Amendment concept into the compact.
Well, yes, it's the first balanced budget amendment that ever addressed in a common sense way the fact that sometimes you need to go into debt. in order to accomplish what needs to be done. As a lifelong farmer and rancher, I can certainly relate to that. There were times that we had to borrow money and other times that we didn't. There were times that we had significant amount of debt. There were other times that we were debt free. It's no different for our country than for the businesses that operate therein. Sometimes you need debt, and as long as it's productive debt, then that's nothing to be afraid of. And I think the Compact for America Balanced Budget Amendment recognizes that. So in Section 2, you also have to have some kind of starting point when this would be enacted. You can't just drop this into the equation without having some kind of initial cushion, if you will, for the Congress to operate with. And so the Section 2 that you have up on your screen, it specifies that the authorized debt initially shall be an amount of equal to 105% of the outstanding debt on the effective date of this article. So let's do some math here. Let's say we have, and I wish we did, only $20 trillion in debt. You're the CPA, Chips. Check my math here. So if this compact BBA is enacted, then at 105%, they would actually start with then $21 trillion of authorized debt on the effective date. Absolutely. Do I have my math right?
You got it right. Yep. There's a cushion there to give them some running room.
That's an initial starting point for Congress. They would have 5% over the date, the debt on the date that the article becomes effective. That's $1 trillion should be a pretty good cushion to start with, and at that point you should realize, hey, we've got to get this financial house in order, and we do have an extra $1 trillion to operate within to do what needs to be done. I think this was a brilliant addition to this, so as to not have a big heavy hammer fall on Congress right from the start. They have restraints of they can only go up to 5% over the initial debt. I think that was important and a wise idea. Section 3, of course, is where
Section 2. I mean, that last sentence in Section 2 is where the NDRA comes in, which basically says Congress cannot increase that debt unless they get approval from the legislatures of the several states as provided in Section 3. So, Curtis, all your hard work paid off.
Yeah, and here's how this would work. Congress, and reading in the first sentence of Section 3, Congress may increase authorized debt to an amount in excess of its initial amount set by Section 2, only if it first publicly refers to the legislatures of the several states an unconditional single subject measure proposing the amount of such increase. What that means is Congress would have to send a proposal to all 50 state legislatures and say, we are going to want to increase the national debt by $2 trillion. And here's why. They would have to make a compelling case to these state legislatures that there's a good reason to increase the federal debt, whether that was war, whether that was some weather catastrophe, whatever it might be. They'd have to make a compelling case to the state legislatures. A simple majority of the state legislatures would need to agree. So 26 states would need to agree. Now, one of the concerns I heard, and it's understandable if you haven't really thought ahead, one of the concerns I heard was, well, won't that be cumbersome and burdensome, and won't it take forever to get the approval of 26 states? And I would point out in response to that, of the 50 states, 46 are in legislative session every year. 4 are not, North Dakota being one of those. It's a biennial session. So you've got an opportunity to run this by 46 states every calendar year. And most of them meet in the first few months of the year. So if Congress was going to be responsible and do their due diligence and prepare a proposal to increase the federal debt, then their golden opportunity to do that would be in the first few months of every calendar year. that should not be an undue burden on Congress to say, hey, we had a big hurricane that beat up several of our states. We've got a war going on in Timbuktu, and that we need to wage and list off 3 or 4 reasons why they need to increase the debt. And so they'd have the opportunity, again, they'd have the opportunity to do that in the first 4 months of every single calendar year. And even if there was an urgent need when at any other time, every state has a quick provision to call its legislature into special session. That can be done in most states. The governor can call the legislature into special session. The legislatures in most states can call them, I believe. I haven't researched all 50 states, but there's always a provision to call a legislature into special session. And if we had, I used this example, God forbid, if we had another 9/11 incident where our country was attacked by terrorists and we needed to respond in an appropriate measure, and it'll take money to do it. If there was an incident like that again in our country, I'll guarantee you that here in North Dakota and every other state, legislators would be grabbing their suitcase, throwing a few clothes in it, and driving to the state capitol in a big hurry to help our country deal with the national emergency. I don't see that as being an undue burden or a big problem logistically, because, and again, you only need 26 of the 50.
Good points. Good points. Before we go to section 4, let me just say one other provision that's in this section is to prevent quid pro quos from Congress offering inducements to certain states to either approve or not approve or what have you. So there is language in here that prevents quid pro quo situations.
Exactly. Good
very
point.
Good. Very good point. So now you got a debt limit. What happens when you start bumping up against the debt limit? Currently, the president has no enforcement mechanisms to cut off spending to prevent the debt limit from being exceeded. That would be even the case if this amendment passes. Slowly but surely, there may be a point when you start bumping up against the debt limit. We realize, the writers of the compact realized they had to give the president the power to enforce this amendment. And so that's what Section 4 does. When the debt limit starts getting close, the president shall then be required to list out a list of impoundments. In other words, expenditures that he's going to defer or put off indefinitely or permanently to prevent the debt limit from being exceeded. Now, there is a check on the president's power here, which is that Congress has the right to designate alternative impoundments. If they don't like the ones that the president came up with, they will propose their alternative impoundments, but that it has to be in the same amount or more. And all that happens within 30 days after the president presents his impoundment listing. Congress then has 30 days to provide an alternative. Then it's the president's requirement to both designate those impoundments and then to enforce the ultimate impoundments that are imposed. If he doesn't do either or both of those, we wanted to make it clear that that was an impeachable misdemeanor. It's your chief executive officer not doing what the board of directors is requiring. And so the alternative is, let that guy go and get somebody else in there that can do the job.
And I think this is an absolutely brilliant part of the BBA. I would classify this as a very good safety valve. When you're getting close, this is the safety valve that will probably prevent having to send a proposal to the states to increase the federal debt.
Yep. The final sentence in this it's subtle, but it's really important. Any purported issuance or incurrence of any debt in excess of the debt limit is void. In other words, if Congress just says we're going to issue more Treasury securities anyway, this becomes a constitutional debt limit at that point. And Wall Street and the folks who sell Treasuries on the national level will know that those securities that are attempted to be sold are not going to be backed by the full faith and credit of the U.S. government. So we actually have a third check on this. not just the states, but the market and those who run the markets in selling Treasury securities. So we believe that's really another good enforcement mechanism. Section 5 is what we call the Grand Compromise, which is where it deals with the tax issue that we talked about in the previous BBA efforts. There's a big push to make it that all tax increases have to have a supermajority vote in both houses of Congress. So the general rule is that no bill that increases taxes shall become law unless it gets 2/3 supermajority votes in each house. But then you had folks on the left, on the left side of the aisle, rightly so, saying, "Hey, look, guys, increased taxes have to be part of the solution. We're so out of balance that you can't make it a requirement that every tax increase has to have a 2/3 supermajority vote. It just won't work. So we're not going to support this bill." Likewise, out of the blue came the two major tax groups, the flat taxers and the fair taxers, and they were both complaining that nothing in the compact addressed either a flat tax or a fair tax solution. And because of that, they were not going to support the compact's balanced budget. We knew we couldn't get this passed. We couldn't get the support of the public if we had this impasse. And so we went back to the drawing board and we came back and said, okay, here's what we'll do. In an effort to appease the flat taxers and the fair taxers, we will say any bill that provides for a new national sales tax that would replace the existing income tax would only have to have simple majority votes. The fair taxers love that. And the folks on the left said, okay, that's a fair compromise. And then finally, we had to say, and let's apply that same 50% vote requirement for any tax that reduces deductions, credits, exemptions, et cetera, that are allowed under the current tax law. The flat taxers and the fair taxers each had a part of the amendment that addressed their issues. And so the flat tax group and the fair tax group both came back and said, good, this works for us. And folks on the left, the moderate Democrats who rightly so were arguing that everything can't be supermajority, they said that there's a lot of room now to generate new taxes with simple majority votes in each house. So we're okay with that. They weren't ever completely happy, but they were okay with it to where they could support it.
Well, I think this is yet another example of the brilliance that went into designing this BBA, because this is yet another section where you have options. You don't just have one option. You have two here. You actually have three in this section. That gives flexibility to Congress to make one of these choices.
Section 6, if you recall, in some of our previous BBAs we looked at, they were trying to define words or didn't define words. And so we have a section in the BBA that defines the key terms, the key provisions, so that there's no uncertainty of what those words mean. Really important provision. I won't go into these details.
Yeah, these definitions are a common part of any legislation, and the more complex the legislation, the more is the need for definitions. Actually, but that is not to suggest that the compact BBA is complex. It is thorough. I think that's a much better way to describe it, rather than complex. I've had people look at this over the years and say, "Oh, that looks pretty complex." And it really isn't. I said, it's not complex, it's thorough. It covers everything.
Good point. And then the final section is, rather than waiting years for this to become effective, some of the BBAs said their BBA would become effective 7 years after its passage. We wanted this to be immediately operative. So that's what this provision. It's self-enforcing, means there's provisions in the compact, in the BBA itself, that enforce it. It's not relying on Congress to enforce it, although this last part does give them the ability to enact conforming legislation to facilitate the enforcement. That's it on a nutshell. Now, I think what's really important is we show who all was involved in the drafting of this. And I just wanted to show, we kept a chart of everybody that was involved in this, that we approached different groups, different individuals, members of Congress, advocacy groups, the media, and we kept track of what their involvement was. Were they primary drafters? Were they policy contributors directly or indirectly? Did they review it? Did they support it? Did they endorse it? We had a number of people that reviewed it and gave us comments, but they said for whatever reason, they could not support it or endorse it, but they wanted to see if we could include their comments into the provision. And we like that. That's fair enough. And we got some really good comments from that. So I think, and we kept track at the bottom. It goes on and on and on. But in the end, we had about 12 different direct people that were part of the process, and their concepts were actually included in the provisions of the BBA. 20 of them were indirectly. We had over 130 people review it, over 106 supported, and this endorsement was back in 2014 when it first came out. Given the state legislators that have passed it in the 5 member states and all, this number is well over 400.
Yeah.
So it wasn't just a group in a back room that came up with this. There was widespread dissemination of this information, and we actively sought people's involvement in coming up with
Exactly.
it.
I recognized that early on in my involvement with Compact for America. You and everyone involved was making a concerted effort to seek input from some really smart people. And I think that is reflected in what a good product came out in the end.
Yeah, it was a 2-year effort, and when I
Right.
previously mentioned the time frame it took us to draft this, it really was a 2-year effort to really decide, do we want to have a drafting convention, or do we want to pre-draft this and get the state legislators on board with this specific policy up front so they can know what they're pushing for? And the state legislators have really responded in a positive fashion, because now they know what it is that they're supporting. They're not waiting on a convention to happen to see what might come from a convention, if anything. That's the BBA. I was wondering if you had any final concluding thoughts on that, Curtis.
I do. I'd like to close out this podcast by sharing a thought that I would invariably share with legislative committees, or when I was on talk radio, I probably did, 30 or 40 radio talk shows all around the country. And I spoke before political groups, and I would always try to conclude with this thought. I have 4 little grandchildren. They have not signed a mortgage. They have not cast a vote. But our generation is incurring massive amounts of debt, and we are sending it to their generation. And it's a terrible abuse of taxation without representation. My grandchildren have no say in what we're doing today.
I think we all feel the same way about that. We don't want to pass on a burden to our children and our grandchildren that buries them, that they can't get out from underneath.
And unfortunately, that's exactly what we are doing right now today.
Well, if we need to get more member states on board and see if we can push this forward. Curtis, I really appreciate your time today and your insights into this and your support really from day one with the Compact. It's been fantastic.
Well, it's an honor for me to be a part of this group.
Well, let me just say that all the documents that were shown today are available for download in the links provided below. Please click on the like and subscribe buttons, share this channel with your friends and colleagues, and click on the notification bell so you can be alerted when our next podcast on the Compact comes out. Our next episode, like I said, will be how the Compact works, We'll describe the interstate compact itself and discuss how it can significantly cut down the time it would take for the states to organize, to propose, and ratify the compact's balanced budget amendment. Thanks for watching, and let's all work together on a nonpartisan basis to restore fiscal sanity to this great country. See you soon for episode 5.